So we want to begin by acknowledging our presence on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Tongva and Kizh Nation peoples and their neighbors from north to south, the Chumash, the Tataviam, Katanamook, Serrano, Cahuilla, Peonkuichum, Ahashiman, Ipai-Tipai, Kumeyaay, and the Quechan peoples, whose ancestors ruled the region that we now call Southern California for at least 9,000 years. Indigenous stewardship and rightful claims to these lands have never been voluntarily relinquished nor legally extinguished. We pay respects to the members and elders of these communities, past and present, who remain caretakers and advocates of the lands, river systems, and the waters and islands of the Santa Barbara Channel. For a more detailed land acknowledgement authored by the USC Van Hunnick History Department, we invite you to visit their website, and in a few minutes I'll put a link for that into the chat. For those of you joining us online, we'd love to know where you're watching from, so feel free also to let us know in the chat. And thank you to those of you who are here in person for our first lecture of the fall semester. The microphones in the room are very sensitive, so I would ask if you do think you're going to be enjoying chips from your lunches, that you open them soon, maybe during the introductions, and munch on them quietly during the lecture. Thank you so much. And then please feel free to help yourself to more food. And those of you joining us on Zoom, come in person sometime and we'll give you some lunch. My name is Martha Stroud, and I'm the Associate Director of the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you today. Just a couple of notes about the Zoom protocols for those joining online. Right now you're viewing a side-by-side of the speaker and slides that are being shared, and you can make either window larger or smaller by dragging the dividing line in between the windows, in case you want to see Sarah bigger or the slides bigger. We will have time for questions and discussion following the lecture, so please ask those using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom window, and those of you in person, we encourage lively discussion, and we'll try to get to as many questions as time permits. And we'll share the chat and the Q&A with Sarah, so Sarah will see all of the questions, even those we don't have time to ask, and comments as well, if you have comments to share. We ask you to please be respectful in the chat to the speaker and to the fellow attendees. So now, to introduce today's lecture and our speaker, it's my pleasure to introduce the founding director of the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research, Chappell Guerin Chair in Jewish Studies and Professor of History at USC, Wolf Brunner.
Thank you very much for joining us here in the room and also on Zoom. And thank you to Martha for doing all the stuff behind the scenes. So without her, this would not be possible. For those who are not familiar with the Center for Advanced Genocide Research, a few words. We just celebrated our 10th anniversary, and not only that, we hosted one of the great international genocide conferences in June, which brought 200 scholars from 46 countries to USC to discuss a huge variety of instances of mass violence and genocide on a global scale and throughout the centuries. The center tries to, with our work, we're trying to advance new areas of interdisciplinary research on these instances of genocide and mass violence. We promote the unique resources we have here at USC, like the USC Shoah Foundation Visual History Archive and other genocide resources in our libraries and special collections. And what we try to do is to really to transform the understanding what we have of the origins, dynamics and consequences of genocide and mass violence, and especially also of the dimensions of resistance. The center has a lively program consisting of events like this, but also we bestow fellows all over the year, from young PhD candidates like Sarah, but also to senior scholars. So one of those fellowships is or gives us the occasion of today. It is the Beth and Arthur Research Fellowship, which is providing support for USC undergraduate and graduate students at any level, kind of from any discipline, to conduct 1 month of residential research at the Center for Advanced Genocide Research, focusing on work with the testimonies of the USC Shoah Foundation Visual History Archive or other resources here at USC. This brings me to welcome our speaker, and the first speaker for this academic year, Sarah Ernst, who is a PhD candidate in the USC Van Hannik History Department. Their dissertation is tentatively titled Queer Bodies and Holocaust Histories. Sarah is researching the living experiences of queer women who are double marginalized as Jews, Roma, or individuals with disabilities during the Holocaust. They want to explore how those individuals were persecuted and discriminated against, how they resisted or reacted, and how they were remembered after the war, including from queer activist groups and Holocaust museums. Sarah Ernst earned their BA in History and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Brandeis with distinction. It's really remarkable at this early stage. Sarah has already presented at several international conferences, ranging from queer studies to the German Studies Association, and also they is scheduled for presenting at a migration conference, which shows you a range of disciplines and fields which their research is actually speaking to. Sarah Ernst earned already numerous international competitive fellowships, for example, the Auschwitz Jewish Center Foundation Fellow, or the German Historical Institute Pre-Dissertation Fellowship. And last but not least, the Beth and Arthur Leff's Research Fellowship here at USC. So give Sarah a warm welcome.
Thank you for that. So I just wanted to open my talk by giving thanks, first of all, to Beth and Arthur Lev, for which this month-long dissertation research wouldn't have been possible. I also wanted to extend thanks to Wolf, Martha, and Maya, all of who made my month-long research this summer a wonderful experience at the center. And I also just wanted to do a quick shout out to my mom. It's her birthday, and she's watching on Zoom, so happy birthday, Mom. Before delving into the findings of this summer, I wanted to open up with my use of the term queer as a term that has been reclaimed in recent years by members of the LGBTQ+ community. Queer is often seen as an umbrella term to talk about sexual acts and desires that are not heteronormative. I also include in my discussion and understanding gender performance, self-identity, and other bodies that are deemed outside of the norm. Indeed, it's a question of sexuality and which can open up more conversations to the multifaceted bodies that we live in. So what then is actually being discussed when I'm thinking about queering Holocaust testimonies? As historian Jennifer Evans mentions in her article, Introduction, Why Queer German History, to think about a queer methodology means to look at the complexities in the histories, to sit with the uncomfortable and the assumptions in order to interrogate not only the past, but how we write about it in the present. In other words, it's thinking about the ways in which sources are developed, read, and written about. Querying Holocaust testimonies, I would posit, also means to think about the entire maze of the body, as Eli Clare writes about in his memoir essay book, Exile and Pride, Disability, Queerness, and Liberation. To think about all aspects is a form of queering in that one does not only go by the labels predetermined by an archive or perpetrator group, or even by individuals themselves, but it brings these aspects into discussion with one another. It's a bit more of a complicated notion of bodies and identities and receptions, but I would stress that, for me, this allows a space to unpack a more human experience that connects histories rather than keeping them separated into distinct fields. Of course, when we talk about the fields, there are some foundational pieces that have shaped the work I'm doing today in reimagining queer Holocaust testimonies. This includes those who have started a path to documenting voices, such as Claudia Schottman's examination of lesbians during the Third Reich and Days of Masquerade, to contextualizing the knowledge production in activist and academic spheres in Jake Newsom's Pink Triangle Legacies. Beyond these text, articles such as the samples seen behind me, which are just a snapshot of the field. They use case studies and microhistories to delve more deeply into considerations of sex, sexuality, and gender for the field of Holocaust studies. So from Anna Heikova's look at queer sexual barter to William Jones's examination of the exploitative sexual relationships and the histories of peoples in the concentration camps, the work done recently on sites of Holocaust violence are commendable and foundational. Others, such as Rosanna Ramsden's look at written memoirs and their utilization of queer fear, as well as Carly Snyder's look at the early work of Joan Ringelheim in the fields of sexual violence and same-sex acts, help reframe the knowledge production of queer Holocaust histories. And others like Xavier Noon and Laurie Marhofer have highlighted the importance of including in these conversations trans histories if we want a more nuanced look at the Nazi state. Again, this is just a snapshot of where the academic field is going, and I wanted to highlight this work here to emphasize I'm not the first to be doing this, but am coming in the footsteps of many others, and it's to this work that I hope to place myself in conversation with and draw some new reimaginings with the work that I did this past summer. So this past summer saw the work of collecting samples of what I was deeming queer testimonies from over 100 videos held at the Visual History Archive here at USC. Now, when thinking about queer history, one of the first questions that I ran into is what keywords I was going to use to try to find information in the testimonies. As queer is not a keyword in the database, and this is largely based on when terminology is encoded as part of the testimony archive and what queer keywords are being used. So this chart here shows just a few of the keywords. And so some of these terms, for those who have worked in the field of gender and sexuality studies or have read about it, that might be more obvious, such as the lesbian sexual activities or homosexual communities. But I wanted to briefly shed a light on some of the other terms that may be less obvious when it comes to queer testimonies, and that's the attitudes toward people with disabilities and the anti-Roma prejudice. And so I use those terms as part of my queering Holocaust history because it's the way in which the bodies can be deemed on the outside. So if we're looking at responses by survivors and they're bringing in attitudes or anti-prejudice, it's a way in which we're seeing about how individuals who were also targeted for genocidal violence are then seen in the testimonies and the ways in which their bodies are being talked about, which can be a way of othering alongside what is typically thought of as queer and the sexuality and sexual acts. And so with this, I hope it's an attempt to sort of create a more conversational history that examines the continuities and discrepancies between these groups. And so when separating the clips watched by the categories through the Visual History Archive, there's right away a pretty obvious lean towards mostly Jewish survivor testimonies, which is also reflective if you look at the larger breakdown of the institutional holdings. That said, I just wanted to highlight here that there are different categories that include participants in the post-war trials, as well as different survivor groups, because it's showing overall that despite there being, more of one group than another, there is the push and the need for inclusive history that's not limited to just one category when talking about Holocaust histories, but instead uses institutions such as the Visual History Archive in its fullness to get a better understanding about certain aspects of the history, such as queer lives and queer bodies. So now that I've addressed some of the more foundational things of what I did over the summer and what I was looking at, I wanted to move on to some highlights of exploration that I did this summer. Here, for this talk, I'm highlighting some of the testimonies that have stuck with me even a few months after my residency. And I want to stress that they are not representative of all of the testimonies watched, but instead highlight different aspects of queering testimony that can perhaps lead to further research work. Of course, if there are aspects that you have questions about that maybe I don't address, I'd be happy to discuss them in the Q&A. So I wanted to start by thinking a bit more figuratively, and that is the use of animal imagery by survivors to discuss queerness in the camps. So what do I mean by that, first of all? So across the video testimonies, animal imagery often emerges when one wants to talk about queer sexual barter among the incarcerated. So we can see here in this part of the testimony from Mark S., he's talking about his time in the Flossenburg concentration camp, where someone in his group was approached by someone who Mark identified as a, quote, homosexual. Here then is an instance of framing the interaction as the obtaining of pets, which is the bolded part of this here. While the terminology of pet might seem innocuous at first, I would argue that the analysis and centering of this language to understand queer knowledge production creates a more ambivalent perspective. In calling fellow prisoners engaging in what may be queer sexual barter or even sexual exploitation as pets, the survivor takes away the agency of that person. In labeling them as an animal, it insinuates that these people had no voice and could only go along with the desires of their, quote, owner. Not only that, but the removal of one's humanity and the labeling of them as a pet can be read as a further condemnation of queer sexual acts. For one, it leaves no consideration of the layers involved in the process of sexual acts that might not be known by the survivor who's talking about someone else, including the circumstances that even led to this observation. And two, the act of sex between a, quote, animal, in this case, the person that is dehumanized, even if figurative, I would say evokes an association to perhaps bestiality, which was also included under paragraph 175, which was the German penal code that made illegal same-sex acts between men. And so just thinking about that there. Indeed, I would say that one could argue this makes this type of act even more deviant because of the implications that emerge when one is reduced to a pet by survivors. The evacuation of animal imagery to talk about queer sex, therefore, removes it from heteronormativity so much that it's hard to ignore the implicit anti-queer discussion that becomes normalized through this figurative dehumanization of those involved in queer acts. What I find perhaps most telling in these dehumanizations, though, is the direct connection to food. So we're going to see here again in another part of an interview. This is from Miriam, and she's talking about her time at the Fallersleben camp. She mentions, and again, this is sort of the bolded part there, she talks about how the girls who were pets were fed better. And so you'll see in both of these examples, Mark and Miriam, there is a point that they don't hesitate to mention to the interviewers this notion of being fed better, getting better food. And so I want to think about a little bit here is maybe a way in which we can queer this aspect of the testimony. And so through that, thinking a bit more about the training of the prisoners and their positions as pets. What do I mean by that? As we see with Mark, he is discussing that this friend from the group, quote, became a homosexual, end quote. On the other hand, Miriam writes about, quote, girls as their pets and the proteges, end quote. The use of pet, then, provides insight into the perception of queerness as something learned and not innate. One could argue that it aligns with the Nazi ideology more broadly on homosexuality at that time, wherein, especially for men, there was a belief that re-education was possible and that they could unlearn their homosexuality. So we can read it not only as talking about the sexual acts, which is, again, inclusive of barter and exploitation in the form of the food, but the training that can only happen when one is dehumanized and reduced to the status of an animal by the one giving the testimony. This could also be read as these survivors trying to make sense of the reality that there were those in the camps who participated in queer sexual barter, there were those in the camps who experienced sexual exploitation, or there were even those in the camp who were queer themselves, as evidenced by Mark's remark that his friend, quote, remained one. if someone is reduced to the status of the pet, they are not like you, and therefore you remain safe from being trained to becoming a homosexual, or so one can read based on these testimonies. Here then, this type of reading of a discussion of queer sexuality adds to works like Anna Heikeva's and William Jones's, in that it thinks critically about the deliberate choice of words by the survivor to create a certain narrative of queerness in the camps, one that, in this instance, is marked by a dehumanization and thus debasing of the queer persons. So another example of animal imagery that I'm going to bring up concerns Esther and her disgust towards the, quote, peacocks of the camp. So the peacocks are some of the women who are the Lagerälteste, and so they're kind of the camp elders, and she's talking about the ways in which they're dressed versus the other prisoners. And so that is the context. She's in Auschwitz, so that's another context thing I'll provide before showing this short clip.
It was in bad taste. We were in rags, and they were strutting like peacocks, you know, black and white silk scarves, and it was in bad taste.
Mm-hmm. I would say a lot of it was.
Audio is a little delayed, but hopefully as you watched it and thought about it, I would stress that when we're thinking about animal imagery, the video testimony as a medium is really important, because as you were watching, Esther's not only discussing the peacocks, but she's also using very visible acts and ways in which to describe that makes clear her disgust towards them. So Esther's comparing the woman walking to the strutting of peacocks. Peacocks, which are males, are known for their showboating and extravagant colors as they try to mate with peahens. Here then, Esther is blurring gender binaries by imagining the women as peacocks, which can be read twofold. Taking literally how peacocks exist in the animal world, Esther speaks here to a form of queer sexual barter, wherein the women were selecting a mate among the prisoners. On the other hand, Esther is describing a certain gender performativity that suggests a particular extravagance that these women performed through their walking. Add on that Esther makes this comparison first by pausing and then almost seeming to spit out the word peacock, makes clear that these women are irredeemable in Esther's eyes. Indeed, the film testimony heightens this by allowing the viewer to witness Esther's scrunched face. In this moment, you can see her disgust. And so if we were to just take her words alone and not have the visual of the video, you can grasp that Esther perceives the queerness as something bad, but I would say that having this visceral reaction makes it hard not to conclude this testimony as a more forceful anti-queer testimony. And so it's a question also of how Esther's words not only inform the certain history that frames gender transgression as something animalistic. The other thing I did want to highlight, however, is the role of the interviewer, and I hope you heard at the very end that moment where after Esther remarks for the second time on the bad taste, the interviewer responds with, quote, "I would say a lot of it was," end quote. Now, could the interviewer have been talking about the general situation in the camps? Perhaps yes, but the fact that there's no additional question of what the bad taste truly was, and the fact that the interviewer inserted herself into the narrative and reaffirmed this negative view, reinforces a tacit role of the testimony to create a heteronormative narrative. That is one that is applauded for removing the humanity of other victims to describe the horrors perpetrated by the Nazis. It's also a reminder that when we think about who has produced anti-queer testimonies in the past, it is not only the survivors who are giving the narratives of their experiences, but those who are supposed to be partial, including the interviewers. And I did want to end this part with Esther to note that this is only one part of Esther's story. So she gave this testimony in 1990 for the JFCS in San Francisco. 9 years later, she gave another video testimony, and that was the one that was for the USC Shoah Foundation. And so, and then in 2003, she published her memoir, On the Shores of Darkness. And yet, the moment that I show you here with the peacocks is only emerging in this first testimony. So that raises more questions about the presentation and preservation of testimonies throughout time. So Esther starts with a queer testimony that is heightened through animal tropes, and then it disappears. How then do we as historians and scholars, and even just public historians looking at the testimonies, how do we categorize and utilize these testimonies for historical analysis? Did Esther become more aware of the visibility of the testimonies and therefore self-censored herself? Did the Shoah Foundation not ask similar questions as JFCS to invoke this memory of queer women? What is the context in which these changes develop? I don't have the right answers, but I do think much needs to be said about the context in which testimonies are given and the timing, which requires a bit more uncovering and exploring beyond the boundaries of the testimony to arrive at this queer history. The field more broadly has seen shifts to use the voice of the survivors to understand prisoner societies and lived experiences amongst the various settings of the Holocaust. And so now this next phase needs to include those dehumanizing moments within the context of the testimonies in their historical, societal, and archival contexts, which I argue would allow for a fuller consideration of a more ambivalent history of queer knowledge production. So again, as the testimony with Esther shows, when reading queer histories, we really need to take into consideration all of the actors, including the interviewer. So I just wanted to show here a few of the questions that came up by interviewers when they were discussing aspects of queer life. So you'll see that some of them, like Barry Silberberg, he asked a rather open-ended question, leaving it in the hands of the survivor to presume the authoritative role in creating an image of queerness in the spaces of the Holocaust. Others, like you'll see up here, like Kay Fink, they situate queer desire and acts within an exploitative sexual relationship. Indeed, the direct connection between the identity term of lesbianism and an emphasis on the force insinuates a certain type of historical perspective. Homophobia in testimonies is well documented by scholars, but I would posit here that we need to think a bit more about the role of the interviewer in pushing that type of narrative. If one is being asked questions that hinge on exploitation and abuse, then even if the narrative refutes that, it nevertheless can create a subconscious response for the interviewee, as well as those watching the testimonies in the coming years, to associate queerness with negative connotations. Indeed, the tonality of the visual testimonies is something I find quite compelling for the breaking down of queer histories within this archive. So we can see at the bottom here, there's Ruth Resnikoff's reaction, and this is a reaction to a survivor mentioning that one could smell homosexuals from a mile away. So Ruth, in this moment, stresses, and you can hear it almost incredulously, the act of smelling. And while I would agree with Ruth in this moment about the kind of bizarre way in which the survivor is talking, what this response does is it takes the interviewer out of the role of the passive guide and become more of an actor. So she embodies this place where instead of, just listening and getting the ways in which she's talking about it can actually create a sort of response that really is interesting to see and something I continue to find within discussions of queerness. And so when we're thinking about how we address these histories, we need to consider not only the turn of phrases within the actual testimonies, the language that's being used, but how it is brought up and the ways in which the interviewer acts in purporting a certain image of queer bodies and queerness and the Holocaust. So even as interviewers take on perhaps a more active role in the production of queer knowledge through the types of questions asked, that does not mean they always have the final say. And so this is where Erica B's account comes in, which stands out compared to the other more homophobic testimonies in the archive. And I chose to look at Erica as not to negate the harsh attitudes toward queerness that is rampant in other testimonies. Rather, it's to acknowledge that we need to analyze the variations in perceptions, which can be done through explorations of the individual human experiences. And so for context of the clip that you'll see, Erica is discussing her time in Auschwitz. And she's discussing how when she was doing work, she was talking to another prisoner about post-camp life. She was overheard by the guards, and she was sent to the punishment commando. So that's the context for this video.
I wound up in the SK, which was the Straf Kommando.
That means punishment command.
It was the punishment commando. And I was sentenced to 60 with the whip every day. So I was sent to the other side of the street, to the non-Jewish side. That's where the Strafkommando barrack was. And the German woman who was in charge of beating me said, just keep screaming, just keep screaming. And she would hit the floor. She never touched me. That entire barrack, I was the only Jew.
Was there anyone else present when this happened?
Oh yeah, there were a lot of these women. They were all paired up. They were all homosexual women who were there because they were homosexual, and they were all in pairs. There was a husband and a wife in each pair. They had absolutely no interest in hurting anyone, and they were very good to me. And I became the Bube. I was the lookout person. So that if a German officer was coming or something, I had to run, yell. They gave me food. They took care of me. And I don't know how much time I spent there, probably 6 or 8 months. And I almost assume that probably helped save my life, because during that period of time, I lived very well. I mean, I ate with them, certainly learned everything about every kind of sexual expression.
You saw it?
Oh, sure, they had no problems. I mean, they just did their thing.
And did they try to inveigle you into it?
Never. They were all with each other, and they paid no attention to me. They really didn't. They were very good to me. And I was very sad when the time was up and I had to go back.
All right. So Erica's recollection of this moment stands in stark contrast to many of the other narratives that touch on queerness, such as the one we saw with Esther talking about the peacocks. And so Erica's testimony provides a more humanistic view of the queer woman. And so this is further emphasized by Erica when she's discussing the Strafkommando and how the queer women were in pairs. So there was a husband and a wife. And there's a few things to unpack in that specific moment of the testimony. So first, Erica's remarking that the women were at Auschwitz because of their sexual identity. And so while, if we're looking actually at the history of queer women during the Holocaust, the likelihood of that is rather small, as in Germany, at least, under paragraph 175, it only related to men. In Austria, it also related to women, so there is the possibility, or that they were arrested for other acts that are also associated with sexual deviancy, which I'd be happy to go into in the Q&A. But the other part of that is the reference to the pairing up. And so here, Erica is making note of a traditional notion of gender roles that most people are aware of, while she's also acknowledging the same-sex nature of the relationships. In this sense, then, Erica perceives the queer relations as heteronormative in the association with a husband and a wife, while also hinting at a certain type of gender and sexual fluidity amongst the husbands in the pairs. That the point in this narrative also stresses that the women had, quote, absolutely no interest, end quote, in causing harm, again highlights that Erica's perception of the woman was different than many of the other narratives. Regardless of whether or not this was due to her being in an intimate space with the women, the testimony opens up an opportunity to understand one way in which queer life existed within the camps that is not tinged by a negative framework. And so you see that as well as the outlook is continued discussing the queer woman, and not only was she given food, but she became the lookout of person who warned the others of the arrival. Erica really continues this type of admiration for the woman as she discusses more about the time spent in the barrack. So for example, you can recall from the scene we just watched the smile in her moment that is rather suggestive when she's daring the interviewer and the people who are watching this testimony to surmise for themselves what she meant by, quote, every kind of sexual act, end quote. So that dialogue going along, again, with the body language that Erica uses at that moment does not go unnoticed by the interviewer who asked Erica, you saw it? And the way in which she replies is very much a matter-of-fact tone that, quote, they just did their thing, end quote. And so once again, Erica's testimony paints a perception of queerness that varies from the common tropes in the scholarship and in survivor testimonies. While others speak about queer sex and sexuality with horror and disgust, Erica acts in a more playful way at times while also being quite serious about the fact that this circumstance saved her life. So Erica demonstrates this with her knowing smile to the camera and then the calm tone she uses in talking about them. And I wanted to, before we leave Erica, go back to the actors as well and just highlight the more tolerant behavior that Erica seems to embody in her interview is not reciprocated in the response by the interviewer. So as Erica was continuing to discuss the woman, the interviewer actually cuts her off, hopefully you caught that moment, and asked, quote, and did they try to inveigle you in it? So the use of the terms that the interviewer is using, alongside the fact that she interrupted Erica, and associates lesbianism or queerness with the deviancy and coercion of the non-queer prisoners. And to Erica's credit, she doesn't agree and she shakes her head and takes on a more serious tone when talking about the fact that they did not pay attention to her. And so this is a key moment in her testimony because it is pushing back against stereotypes towards queerness that were quite rampant, whether in the scholarship, but also in public attitudes, and especially seeing women as, you know, predators and the trope of that. And so that is something that Erica is disagreeing with by looking at this film's testimony. And again, I just wanted to acknowledge that while Erica's story is an individual narrative, other experiences will not necessarily correlate with her view. And indeed, Erica was in a unique position due to the intimate space of the Strafkommando that she was in for many months. Perhaps then that is what makes Erica's testimony so important. By addressing a moment of intimacy that is not filled with horror, Erica's memories provide a framework to rethink how we can use survivors and their testimonies to think about perceptions of queerness. Even if it's just Erica's testimony that reflects a more positive feeling, her one narrative demonstrates that perhaps there's more to the queer experience than historians have uncovered so far in researching the film's testimonies. And so the last kind of example that I want to show is the role of queer kinship in testimonies. So I want to do that by looking at Ken and Roman. And so for those who have read works in the field on sexual violence in the camps, you might have come across the life experience of Ken. He was a survivor who was forced into sexual relationships with older prisoners in the Flossenburg concentration camp. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that by stressing that his experience of sexual violence is important and cannot be ignored in the history, and I'm grateful to the scholars who have done that work. That part of the testimony is very striking, but it's that the other aspect that stuck with me was actually the very end of his testimony. And that's what I want to show today, which is Ken's introduction to his friend, Jimmy Draper. So this moment comes at the end of the Shoah Foundation's interviews, which is usually when a survivor brings their family into the video, both to show the family as well as provide some insight, which I'm going to come back to. So.
Ken, will you introduce us to who's sitting next to you, please?
Sitting next to me is my very dear and loyal friend, Jimmy Draper. We have been together for 32 years, and quite frankly, I don't know what I would do without him, because he looks after me, he makes me feel comfortable, he cares for me, and he also carries quite a lot of my burdens as well. He is a wonderful, wonderful, person.
Jimmy, what would you like to say?
Well, that is a hard one to follow. But what I would like to say is that it's quite true. I've known Ken for all those years. And when I first knew him, I knew little of the Holocaust or of the survivors. And indeed, when Ken started telling me about it, I was rather horrified and felt really sad sometimes. I suppose purely because I was in nursing and it was a caring profession, and I was coming home having administered tender and loving care, hopefully. And I felt sad that Ken should be remembering this kind of event in his life. And I did say to him, I think it would be a good idea if you now try to forget about it and look to the future. He said very pertinently, "Oh no, Jimmy, I must never forget."
So in this clip, what I find really important about Ken and Jimmy's testimony is it's working to function as a type of queering of the bonds of kinship for Holocaust survivors. So more specifically, it reminds us to consider and bring into conversations not only queerness in terms of sexuality, sexual acts, and gender identity, but also those who elected to be in companionships that defy the heteronormative or hegemonic notions of the family as being a biological one. So thinking of, the typical nuclear family of the mom, dad, and 2 kids. For so many survivors, the discussion of keeping Judaism alive for the biological family is present, especially when you're looking at this last segment of the testimonies, which is where the family is brought in. So oftentimes it's children, grandchildren, a variety of people. And yet Ken and Jimmy don't do that. Yet their 32 years of being together cannot and should not be ignored. Ken remarks that he does not know what he would do without Jimmy. Jimmy, in his professional role as a caretaker, navigates the various ways to help Ken as someone who did not experience the Holocaust themselves. And with that, it creates this ending to the testimony that is not centered on the biological continuation of the Jewish community. Instead, sitting with this and thinking about the relationship here, it's a way in which we can think about different avenues and different forms of queership and belonging that come about after the Holocaust. The ways in which folks, are working with people who did not experience, but nevertheless are finding a place and a comfort for them. Jimmy is the one who is brought into this testimony instead of children or grandchildren. He is the one who will be forever remembered as a part of Ken's family. Which leads me to show another way in which this queer kinship is brought about through Ken's testimony. So what we see here is a little snippet of the page of the PIQ, which is the pre-interview questionnaire that the Shoah Foundation provides. So you'll see that in the version in 1998, the Shoah Foundation put forward that, quote, "if you are the relative of a survivor and agreed to be on camera," end quote. So relative does insinuate a type of person that the survivor would ask to come in at the end as they talk about the present day. Yet, as we see here, let's go in a circle. Yeah, so as we see here, someone, whether it was the interviewer, whether it was Ken, they crossed out relative and put friend. This, I would argue, is an explicit querying of the archive by redefining the boundaries put up by the archival institution. Rather than keep to the structure, thereby not allowing Jimmy to appear, this team of actors worked to bend the expectation and leave a permanent reminder of the landscape that had been shifted. This moment especially is one I want to expand on and think more about because it helps us reconsider what we think about when we look at survivorship and healing beyond the bounds of typical understandings of kinship. Doing this in the context of the Holocaust, I would say, also allows us to reveal more histories of individuals who survived and then opted out of biological families, instead creating other spaces of community. How do foregrounding these relationships and their stories reframe understandings of community and survival? In what ways does this open up a new avenue for interdisciplinary histories on different life experiences that have been ignored, put on the side or erased within the broader scope of Holocaust history, such as those who opted into queer kinship. So where then do we go from all of these explorations that I've sort of talked about through these examples? So for my work, I envision there to be 3 key aspects of the future research. So the first one being expanding the intersectional approach. So this is delving more into video testimonies that talk about race, ethnicity, as well as other victim groups. So if you'll recall from the chart that I showed at the beginning, for example, Jehovah's Witnesses, looking into them and seeing the ways in which they experience. It's also looking into more video testimonies and doing more research at the Visual History Archive, which I'm grateful I'll be able to continue to do as a USC student, but also through the Shoah Foundation's non-residential colloquium on LGBT life in the Holocaust. So I'm excited to be able to continue to do this work in that space. And then also engaging more with queer and trans theory and archival practices, and thinking about the ways in which we can step outside of the field and be able to delve a little bit more into seeing how other historians, other scholars, other public people have found ways to find the past that have been erased or ignored. Queer histories not only create space for pasts that have been silenced, but they also reckon with how these silences came to be. The work shown here today pushes the field to consider some of the people, spaces, and places that have been overlooked. Above all, queer histories are fluid and messy, and I hope that this reimagining, which will lead to my future work and hopefully other work, will help devote time to the messiness of the archives and begin to draw a little bit of a clearer picture. So thank you.
Sarah, thank you so much. That was fantastic. So now we'll start Q&A, and just a reminder for those on Zoom, as if I have to tell you 4 years into our Zoom land, to use the Q&A feature at the bottom, and I'll read your questions in the room. And then, Sarah, do you mind calling on people directly?
Sure.
And I'm just going to stop your share before we get started.
Charlotte.
Thank you so much for such an amazing lecture. It's always such a joy to watch you work. As you mentioned, queer was not a search term in the VHA, and at the end you were talking about the ways in which we can queer archival practices. So I was just wondering if you think queer would be helpful in the indexing term, or the ways in which it would obscure or clarify the histories you're looking at.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard because when we're looking at the ways in which keywords are being brought up, it's very much coming through listening to what the survivor is talking about or the interviewer brings up in a question. And if we jump back to when the majority of these testimonies were being done, which is in the 1990s, queer is not being a term that's being used. And so it is very much a more, working way in which even like the reclaiming of queerness is still something that not the entire community does. And so like taking that into consideration, I also, I do wonder, especially since my interest in queerness, goes beyond the sexuality and sexual acts and gender, that it would obscure those ones that we could perhaps find if we are just being more intentional about looking at like prejudices or attitudes and being able to sit with those testimonies and read them in that way, because that also then helps us see, if we're thinking about queerness as an othering, then that allows us to see more of the ways in which even just Jewish bodies are othered and created and made queer by the Nazis and how that's discussed. And so, I don't know if it would be helpful, maybe if there's more testimonies being done now, but then you also run into the question of, as survivors age and stuff, what types of testimonies do you come towards? But I think, it is a continuing question in the field, but that's just some thoughts, I guess.
I want to comment on that because I'm the thesaurus specialist, so I work on the keywords, and we actually did reconfigure a lot of the terms this year. For instance, we had an experience with homosexual survivors, which we no longer do. But we did consider the term queer and decided against it because of it being too broad. So I think your work shows like you're a good researcher. You're able to delve into other ways of finding things that represent this broader term. But we, just to let you know, we did consider that term and decided against it.
Appreciate that.
I also work with testimonies, and I indexed a second testimony from the second survivor, the woman who's in the camp. And the same story comes up. It doesn't with your first survivor, but it comes up in the second time. And in the second rendering of it, she's far more animated and playful, even humorous about it. And she extends the story and talks about how in her current life, whenever she moves to a new town, she seeks out gay folks to become friends with, and she encourages her straight friends to find gay friends. Yes. So I wanted to know if you were aware of that additional testimony and how this wasn't just an episode in her life, it was a sort of transformational episode that has led her to these kinds of friendships.
Thank you for bringing that up. Yes, Erica's story, looking at the fact that she, again, like Esther, does multiple narratives, and the ways in which she talks about it and discusses, and it's important to think about the ways in which the present day and the ways in which you interact with communities informs also the ways in which you bring it up and discuss if you feel, and that's, I think, something that's really important is the fact that I think for those who might be on the outside of the VHA might just think that all of them are only done by the Shoah Foundation, but really the VHA has so many other smaller testimony groups that they incorporate in. So you do have the chance where even if you're searching for a term and a person comes up, I found this summer that I actually, when I then searched the person, a different testimony would come up that might have had different keywords depending on who's, indexing. And so it's just a way in which you really have to kind of play with the system and think about it. But thank you for bringing that up.
Just to extend on this, I think part of this, the indexing was done differently, let's say, with a different understanding of certain terms, let's say 20 years ago than it is today when these other collections are incorporated. So I think there is already because they are now incorporated, there's a different understanding about these things. What I found really interesting is the story about the interview where the one scene is mentioned and then it's left out in the next interview in the memoir. And so interesting is when you follow kind of self-reflections over time and testimonies over time, narratives change and they have a lot to do with the environment. And you mentioned this, with the context. And so I was wondering, sometimes we see actually that the more time progresses, themes come up which were not mentioned in the interview, like I think it's Molly Applebaum, it's kind of very late kind of mentioning sexual violence, which was not mentioned in earlier testimonies. And but you mentioned the opposite, actually, that stories are now kind of erased from the narrative. And can you maybe elaborate a little bit more what you think about, for example, the actual historical context, like the 1990s? What time is this actually for the gay movement? Does this affect a little bit also? What are the expectations at the time towards, first of all, the interviewer as a person creates a certain audience, but then there's the hidden audience, which is the obvious audience. Later, people will watch this testimony. How does this kind of actually influences also the narrative?
Yeah, I definitely think the historical context is important, and so thinking about, as you're moving from the early 1990s to later, so you're going to see just in broader context of thinking of the height of the AIDS epidemic is more towards the early 1990s than later, and so when you have drugs like AZT that are coming out, and so then there's less deaths, there is changing perceptions towards queer individuals. But I also think like something that is that I would love to delve into more is the fact that Esther's first interview was not with the Shoah Foundation and her second one was. And I would love to see if there's a way in which, because the Shoah Foundation, when you think the Shoah Foundation Visual History Archive, it's like, okay, Steven Spielberg, and it's like connection coming out around the same time as Schindler's List. And so there is very much more of a, I think, when you're talking about where survivors are providing their testimonies, there is more of name recognition to the Shoah Foundation. And so I think that does play in then towards, and something to delve into, more towards respectability politics in the way in which you're presenting yourself. Whereas, depending on life circumstances, how you're going to talk about things. I mean, I would love to see if anyone knows if Esther's, personal writings or anything is found in an archive, that would be great. Because I do think that there is something to be had about the ways in which she removes it and thereby makes a more respectable, quote unquote, respectable image, wherein she's not, participating in this anti-queerness in the later ones. So yeah, I don't know.
Can I extend it? So you think the smaller archive, which is the first one, in a way creates an audience which is very different from the later archive, which is the visual history archive, because of the publicity of the archive and the recognition. So you need to think about also the kind of the archive as an audience in a way, which adds an extra layer to.
Yeah, and just adding more layers. I think that's the gist of queer histories, just adding more layers and finding more things.
So there's a question on Zoom which is somewhat related to this. In terms of my point about Esther's testimony would be that it was collected in the Bay Area in San Francisco, and still there's this homophobic tinge, and someone on Zoom has asked a question that sort of relates to this, and it's several parts. Each part is equally wonderful, so I will ask them all, but the first, do you work with non-English testimonies? And if yes, do you see any difference concerning the approach to queerness based on the personal background, I mean the country of origin? The second part, did you think about analyzing the compensation requests filed to institutions like the Claims Conference? And third, how do you think the post-1945 has influenced the way how queer stories are narrated? It seems crucial if you land in San Francisco, Israel, or West Germany, all places with distinct regimes concerning homosexuality between 1945 and the 1990s.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, lots of good questions. I'll start with the easy one. Yes, looking at German as well as some French. And so I think there is a difference, especially if you look at the types of the communities in which you're looking at. So I didn't bring up in this talk the communities that are labeled gay male survivor, but you have in there German, Dutch, and in English, and then a French. And so that is going to be a different way in which experiences, because they are people who experience specifically persecution for their queer identities. There's going to be a difference in the way that comes up. And I would say the countries of origins, I think that matters not only just for the non-English, but the English themselves. And so I think that is something that kind of is beginning to be discussed a lot more, of the ways in which people are coming from, people who are living, especially Jewish survivors who are living all across Europe, are coming into these spaces. And so then you have to reckon with the different lives that they're coming in and growing up in. I know there's, recent work that's been looking at the ways in which religiosity might play into perceptions of queerness. So yeah, compensation, yes, I do want to look at the compensation files. I haven't gotten there yet, but that is on my list. And the collection of the Bay Area, I find this interesting because another testimony, which I did not bring up here, is also very anti-queer, and that's also done in the Bay Area. And so I think that's something I have to delve into a little bit more about the specific location, because if you're walking in just a normal, just a person who might have some general knowledge about the United States, San Francisco does kind of come up as, a hub of queer life, and yet there are these examples where it is very much. And so I don't know if it's the space within the JFCS. I think there could be more done to kind of look. I'm not quite sure. I mean, I would love to look more than, I think that's a matter of like archives in the institution and the ways in which, okay, how are questions being asked? So is queerness being brought up more because of their positionality in San Francisco? But I do think the post-1945 in the narration, I think location really does matter. And that's something that I hope to delve into more with the later research. So maybe keep your eye out for like 5 years from now when the dissertation is done. Yeah. Yeah.
So at the beginning of the talk, you emphasized like the physicality and actually watching the visual component of the testimony, not just looking at the transcript. I was wondering, is there a way to incorporate these readings where you're able to queer it in a visual sense into non-visual mediums like a audio-only testimony or a textual source?
I hope so. Yeah, I mean, the textual sources, I will say, I mean, Rosanna Ramsden's work and Anna Hugvo's work, I mean, the people who I talked about at the beginning, they're very influential for me in thinking about the ways in which written memoirs can be read and queered. Audio testimonies, I haven't delved as much into, but I would love to. And I think, like, yeah, I think the visual helps for me to like emphasize, but the reality is that when we talk about this work, it's not always going to be in a presentation where I can show the video. And so I think really kind of working and going beyond the field, because again, this is work that is being done by scholars across disciplines and thinking about the ways in which to reread against the grain. And using their techniques to be able to delve into these sources that we don't have the visual cues, but nevertheless, they are discussing, or if they're not like explicit, how can we read the implicit discussions of queerness? So hopefully that answered. But.
Here's another question on Zoom. This one is from the other 2024 Lab Student Research Fellow, Alexia. Thank you so much for your presentation, Sarah. I loved it. I'm so proud of you. In your presentation, you mentioned, Esther only mentions the description of the peacocks in that one testimony and not in the other one she provided. I know we've talked about that a little more. Have you encountered this with other testimonies that you saw during your fellowship where people gave interviews multiple times?
Yeah. I mean, I think the ways in which it's brought up changes a little bit. So there was someone else, the name of which is leaving my mind, but he had given testimony and was talking about being in a prison and experiencing, and the ways in which he talks about it does differ between the two testimonies. I've started to look into written memoirs versus the video testimonies for those that I've looked at. So for example, another one, Emil Landau, his written memoir does not include anything, but he does discuss queerness. And this is a call for if anyone has access to Ken Roman's memoir. It is published in Canada, but it is based on WorldCat, only available at 3 libraries. So if anyone has been able to access, it's a very small publisher, and I would love to be able to look at that written memoir and see the ways, especially because Ken's story is so important in discussing sexual violence, to think about the ways in which that emerges.
Any other questions? All right, well, thank you so much, Sarah. And before we conclude, I just want to thank, on behalf of the center and all the scholars who have been supported by this fellowship, I want to thank Beth and Arthur Lev so much. And if you feel inspired, if you're watching the video, those of you in person, the applications are currently open for the next cycle of the Beth and Arthur Lev Student Research Fellowship. So we encourage you to apply. And please attend our upcoming events. We have a lecture 2 weeks from today by Todd Pressner on his new book, The Ethics of the Algorithm.
So please join us, and thank you again.
Thank you.